Okay, welcome back to Pop Goes the Legal. We're really excited to be joined today by Judith Wallace, who is the managing partner and chair of the art law department at Carter Ledyard and Milburn LLP. She spent 2 decades representing collectors, foundations, and artists in high-stakes ownership disputes, including winning a landmark case before New York's highest court over Jacques Lipschitz's monumental sculpture, The Cry. I think I butchered that name in every single possible way. Today, we're going to talk about another museum heist, which appears to be all the rage in the art community these days. March 22nd, 4 hooded thieves forced their way into, I'm going to butcher this name too, Magnani Rocca Foundation, a private museum in rural Villa, south of France, and stole 3 masterworks. We're going to talk about the implications of that heist and I guess the broader implication of this growing trend of brazen art heists. But first, Judith, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always fun to talk about these topics.
All right, great. Well, I guess first off, how, before we get into the nitty gritty of what happened here, how did you kind of get into art law? Talk us through how you kind of found that path.
Okay, well, first step was to be really interested in environmental law and go to Georgetown and take every environmental law class they had, and then to come to a New York firm because of their environmental practice, and as a first year, be involved in 2 cases that basically went to trial, one on authenticity and one on ownership of artwork. And so that gave me the diversion, and it's based on the strong practice that we had at the firm, where it's based on at Carter Ledyard, based on the combination of the private client practice and the trust estates practice and the tax exempt, and the fact that a lot of these things happen in the context of estates, which was the case with The Cry. When there's witnesses missing, and evidence and artwork and evidence starts to scatter, that's when disputes get really thorny, and that was sort of our sweet spot, and that's how I ended up handling these cases really right from the start, and it's been 20 years since.
So educate me and my audience. You said that The Cry involves, I guess, an estate, and the question was going to be, this is a private foundation that lost this work of art. Who's liable? The foundation, the insurer? Is it a mix of liable parties? And how does the estate kind of factor into all that?
So in the case of The Cry, just an estate, there wasn't a foundation or museum involved in that. That was just a private owner who had a claim against the estate for the artwork. The claim was that the decedent, Eula Lipschitz, who was Jacques Lipschitz was the artist. Eula was his widow.
I think I did say it right.
Yeah. No, it wasn't bad. I didn't. Yes. So his widow, her partner was received numerous gifts of artwork over the years. This one was anomalous because it was monumental in size. So he couldn't take it with him, either to move or bring to a dealer. And so it was in storage at the time of the gift. So the facts were a little different. And so we had to make a claim against it, against the estate when she died. And so we ended up litigating basically what you have to prove to show that you were a recipient of a gift of artwork. And we'll talk later about sort of what that illustrates about why ownership title claims to artwork are really can be challenging. Yeah. But the question you asked was sort of who's liable.
Right.
So you have you may have a claim against an insurer if the work's insured and you're the policyholder, or have rights under the policy, like you're an additional insured or a lost payee. You'll have a claim against an insurance company, and there might be reasons not to pursue that. But you also have claim against the thief, and you'll also have a claim against anybody after the thief who might come into possession of the artwork. And there are good reasons in New York why you might prefer to litigate against the parties down the line.
Why is that?
So the thief could be New York. One of the quirks of New York is that your claim is ripe when you make a demand, ripe, and you can pursue it when you make a claim against when you make a claim against someone who's in possession of the artwork. Your claim against the thief starts running at the time of the theft. Your claim against say, a good faith later purchaser runs from the time of your demand and their refusal. And that could be many years later, but it's often a lot easier to litigate the claims against somebody who's not a crook. When it pops up, and the circumstances might be such that it does make it easier to pursue your claim, right? It's in the hands of an auction house that's not just going to willy-nilly turn it over, and it's not going to disappear underground again.
Right.
And so that's part of the calculation of what you do when you report a theft is what's actually most likely to result in the recovery of the artwork. And there are pros and cons of a lot of these approaches.
Right. Question I have is it's not likely that this artwork just kind of pops up unless they find the thieves, and even then it might be difficult to find the artwork. So what do you anticipate the investigative process look like? How are they looking for these masterworks forever in perpetuity until they find them? At a certain point, like law enforcement's going to stop looking, I would imagine, but will there be private investigation kind of?
So one of the things that we recommend, strongly recommend that people consider when they have missing artwork is to report it to the Art Loss Register, which is an entity run out of the UK. And they'll do searches and they will pursue things. They have contacts with law enforcement, and you'll pay them a premium. If it's recovered through Art Loss, if their specialists recover it or are responsible for you recovering it, you'll pay them 20%. But I've had stuff come through claims come through for clients decades down the line.
Wow.
Right, because it changes hands often enough that maybe it's sold to somebody who doesn't know that it was stolen, and they innocently then consign it. And we also encourage people who buy artwork to insist on an Art Loss Register search before they purchase. It is part of due diligence with reputable sellers, right? So, a good, and like if you consign work to Christie's, they'll or Sotheby's, they'll run that list. They have other lists of disputed property that they'll check as part of their sort of standard due diligence, even if the Carbonari in Italy aren't actively, don't have an officer assigned to this task. It's on these
Which
works are on
this one they will, but
for a while,
yeah.
Right? As your point.
So is it? We do a lot of real estate here. Is there a corollary to title insurance in the art world? So is the buyer 8 buyers down the line able to kind of point to chain of custody and figure out whether or not there was a theft in the past, or is there not a similar mechanism to make sure you're protected?
So there is a thing called title insurance in the art world, but it doesn't function like title insurance in real estate. It's fairly expensive, and it's for the duration of your ownership of the artwork. So it doesn't get you very far in terms of being able to sell an artwork and not have liability. So it doesn't serve the same function of being able to sell a work, and unless you're specially negotiating it, to be able to get a work and then be able to sell it onward without fear of liability for the purchase price. There are sort of bespoke terms that you can get, but again, it's not like it's not customary because of the high price and sort of the customary limitations on it. And one of the reasons is because, unlike real estate, which I know is your area, you don't have a system for registry of title of artworks. Which is one of the reasons why even families that have had artwork in their possession, in their families for decades, can find themselves scrambling at even in the current day when everybody's photographing every salad that they eat, to have some kind of evidence that this artwork that they owned, what artwork was in their possession, in their families, and for how long. Oftentimes people aren't insuring artwork. Often people aren't itemizing on their insurance, and often they're not photographing or documenting when it was held. And often in estates, they're not being the property that's being the personal property, the movable personal property like artwork and jewelry that's being transferred isn't necessarily, unless there's an appraisal as part of the estate, isn't being listed out and tracked in a way that then allows us to document how it was transferred. And the provenance that, and because of the tradition of confidentiality and tradition and tolerance of confidentiality in art transactions, means that bills of sale and invoices and provenance ownership history that's presented and exchanged in the context of art law transactions is often laughably vague, right? Private collection, Connecticut.
Yeah.
Private collection, Monte Carlo, and then the name of a dealer. And then it's not helpful to someone years later tracking down what happened and when. It's theoretically possible that the gallery that sold it may have known who everybody was, and they're protecting their sources in providing a provenance like this.
Mhm.
But to somebody who's trying to break this down 10 years later and prove their rights, it's really challenging.
So you mentioned diligence before. What kind of diligence? I know we're going a little far afield from the theft now, but what kind of diligence is available to a buyer who wants to be really well protected? I mean, obviously, for something like this, um, you you can't kind of willfully disregard news stories that are out there about this is stolen pieces
Right.
of art. And you Google this and you find out, okay, well, this is stolen. But for other pieces, really valuable, expensive pieces, what kind of diligence is available to buyers?
So, so this is why one of the reasons I mentioned the art loss register.
Yeah.
You might see red flags in the ownership history.
Mhm.
You take a good look at the back of the art of the work of art and see what stickers are on there. Sometimes that will provide some clues.
So stolen in the back, and you should probably.
No, it might have a yeah. You might have gallery stickers if they were exhibited, showing that someone had possession for a while, and that might provide some clues to either substantiate um the provide clues to substantiate the provenance that you have from the owner. Um, as the um the recent case with the Art Institute of Chicago, um, that was litigated in New York. It was in the news like about a year ago, April. Um, it was one of these Egon Schiele artworks that came out of Austria, in the out of Vienna, during World War II, and this one sort of illustrated, the decision in April provided a really useful sort of roadmap of what all the lists and all the decisions and all the things that you would expect someone to do to check and pursue what you'd expect someone to be aware of when buying artwork that had uh, sort of a vague ownership history,
Mhm.
and that was in Europe during the Second World War, especially with a known with anyone with a Jewish family member somewhere in the ownership history. There's a red flag there that you need to do more digging, and it provided a good roadmap. During the Salander bankruptcy, the Salander gallery went spectacularly bankrupt, and a lot of artists and consigners lost artwork that was disappeared into the bankruptcy because they didn't because of lack of sort of UCC filings to show their security interest in the artwork. And there was a good decision there that sort of indicated a lot of the things you should be wary of that could be red flags that could end up undoing your title, even if you bought it from another gallery that was perfectly reputable, which would usually, under our system, would usually give you sort of um, confidence that you could rely on the title that you're getting from a seller. Um, that the circumstances, the price. If the price was unusual, if there was anything about the circumstances that were unusual, there's a rush.
Mhm.
Not exactly uh, uh, being sold out of the trunk of a car, but the fine art equivalent. you need to make a decision now. This is, you shouldn't contact, do not contact the artist, do not
Right.
contact these people. I'm handling this. In those cases, there were a lot of red flags, but they were things that the various players sort of had explanations for. But one of the challenges of the lack of a registry of title and this tradition of confidentiality in the market is that what's deemed reasonable is kind of dependent on a reviewing court.
Yeah.
And two courts, one in 2010, one in 2012, and one in 2025, reached totally different decisions about what to do that's reasonable with respect to the stolen artworks from this group of Egon Schiele's works that were from the same family in Austria.
Yeah. So there's not even like a reliable roadmap in the courts as to the standard you need to meet in order to pursue adequate diligence.
Exactly. And it's constantly evolving.
Just don't buy it out of the back trunk of a car. That's the baseline.
That's
right?
a solid rule. Or anything like the equivalent of it, but that's certainly not what the Art Institute of Chicago sort of did.
Yeah.
But that was what the court found, that sitting here in 2025 with looking back at all the opportunities and things that they should have known at the time, their purchase from a perfectly reputable gallery when they bought it, I think was in the 70s, was not did not meet the standards of the court in 2025.
Wow.
So the penalties for not, so it's a harsh rule.
Yeah.
And New York is really friendly. New York is a jurisdiction that's really friendly to older claims.
Especially because you would think that the diligence in the 70s, I'm sure that there were some mind-altering substances that many artists were indulging in the 70s, probably very different. And also just the available tools in the 70s to conduct diligence just so different from what's available even, the beginning of the century, right? So it's just a stark difference in the availability of diligence.
Right. And new information and new archives are being digitized at an incredible rate.
Yeah.
So there's more information available every single day
to
research things that may even have been in your collection for decades.
I'm sure generative AI is going to transform this field also.
Oh, sure. Because it'll allow you to search for search terms. But I'll tell you just anecdotally, for a random Google search a few years ago, I found my grandfather's personal letters that have been digitized at the Harvard Divinity School.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Just, like when you're up late at night, sort of randomly throwing things into Google.
Yeah.
Yes, you can find your family members' correspondence.
I can't even find my AirPods half the time. It's really impressive. So the back of the car analogy actually just got me thinking about something else that I want to talk to you about, which is what is the roadmap for these thieves? It would appear to me that you wouldn't be able to touch this artwork with a 10-foot pole if you're a reputable investor, dealer, etc. Right now, everybody's looking for it. So I'm guessing wait and see is probably the modus operandi anyway. But even a year from now or 2 years from now, like what's the available way to profit off of this type of theft?
So
not that you're giving legal advice to thieves out there, but
no, what I can say is what you see, right? So sometimes people will put them in a free port, keep them offshore, keep them in a jurisdiction that's friendlier to
art theft,
friendlier to a purchaser who buys in good faith, right? So New York is a jurisdiction that isn't that friendly, right? And so I mentioned this, our statute of limitations, which is from a case called Guggenheim versus Lubell. So that case also involves stolen art, stolen from the Guggenheim. So decades later, it pops up. They realize that it's in the hands of this collector. They paid good money. They had no reason to think it was stolen. They had it on their living room wall. They lent it out. The New York rule, so like across the river in New Jersey, they have a discovery rule. Your claim, your deadline to file a claim, to assert a claim against anyone for lost or stolen art runs for when you knew or should have known that it was missing. So it's a pretty harsh rule. So you don't have to worry about what happens in 30 years. If you're making that claim, if the jurisdiction remains New Jersey. But But in New York, it's 3 years from the time the deadline, and there are ways that the courts will weigh the equities of having a late claim. But your deadline, your absolute legal deadline to make a claim against someone, runs against the thief for when the theft occurred, because they know what they did was wrong at the time.
Even if you haven't identified who the thief is?
That is correct.
It's a John Doe filing?
But there's no one, you can't make that filing because you can't serve those papers on anybody.
Right, okay.
I mean, the best you can do is put somebody on notice put the world sort of on notice by filing with the art loss register.
Mm-hmm.
The art loss register isn't open, but a gallery that receives something and wants to check and pays the $20 or $40 or whatever it is, and has them run the number, run the image. But in New York, the rule is that you make if it shows up, if you can locate your buyer, or if you can locate the work, you make a demand on the party that's in possession, and that doesn't have to be the owner. It can be the gallery. It happens to be a gallery that has it on the wall. I had a client that did so with respect to a work that was sold. It was an unauthorized sale by a gallery. It was by the Salander Gallery in 2007. They didn't know where it went, and it showed up at the Winter Antique Show, and they made a demand on the gallery that had it. And that person wasn't gonna ship it off to Switzerland. Right. They have, they hung on to it, and then we were off to the races.
Okay.
At the end of the day, so you can keep it in a Freeport. You can keep it on your, you keep it on your 1,000-foot yacht. You can keep it in your, in your safe room. But if it's going to change hands through, somebody at some point is going to mess up, hopefully. And if it shows up at a gallery, at a art fair, at an exhibition, because somebody somewhere sold it and didn't disclose that it was stolen, and that person in good faith then lets it out into the world, then that's an opportunity for someone to make a claim. And
so basically you need to wait until it gets into the hands of somebody honest in order to retrieve it for the most part.
That's one strategy. Right, if the trail is cold, that's kind of your only move.
Right.
And hope that it ends up what you have to show to win is going to be different depending on where you are.
Yeah.
Right? If you are and so there's a real benefit to being in New York. If you're in, say, Switzerland, they're going to presume good faith on the part of the purchaser, and you're going to have much more of an uphill climb in some jurisdictions than you would in others to prevail on the merits, which is why the heirs wanted to recover the work from the Art Institute of Chicago. They brought their claim here based on events that it had, and then they got the DA involved based on events that occurred here. You're usually looking for some sort of link to a jurisdiction that has a good legal rule.
Right. So my understanding of what happened in Italy is that the foundation didn't kind of kept the theft quiet for, I guess, over a week before they publicly reported it. It almost feels like a movie plot where you're like hoping the thieves come back to catch them in the act, which would happen in the movies, right? And then things would go wrong, and there would be. So that was my instinct: was how much liability is the foundation taking on for enacting a plan like this, where if the thieves do come back, there's things could go 100 different ways with that type of strategy. So, what did you think about that recovery strategy? Is that one that you've heard of other galleries employing in similar circumstances?
I think it's common, right, to not. So you might not want to, if you had, for example, if you still had security issues, you might not want to publicize them before you had a chance to fix them. You want a chance to assess the evidence before letting the thieves know what you know and when. You might want to. I mean, if the works are insured, which is not a given with museums, right. Many museums self-insure. You would certainly tell your insurer, but they don't necessarily need to go public either. Mm-hmm. And give them a chance. You also might not want 1,000 amateur reporters crawling all over your crime scene.
Right. I guess also one of the first instincts might be somebody inside the building helped out with this, and this is a way for us to internally investigate. That might be the fastest path to figuring out who did it by finding who in the building was involved.
Right. And you can do that without revealing. I mean, with the masked, um, with a sort of smash and grab like there was in Magnani Rocca, there's no question that everybody knows what happened. But it's also often the case that you might not know. It might not be as obvious to everyone that that a theft occurred. Like in the Guggenheim case, they didn't discover it for a long time. But then even when they did, they still kept investigating to try and figure out who might have found it, so that they could have a hope of to be able to pursue the investigation of the theft, and hopefully track down the thief and have the best chance of doing that. You're the law enforcement person at the table.
Former law enforcement person. Former law enforcement person. So, let's say this artwork is recovered in the next year. Is there kind of like a permanent black mark against the art moving forward? Or does it recover kind of full value once, assuming that it wasn't damaged or desecrated in any way? Is there,
Yeah. No, no, there isn't really a
or
black.
does it go up? Does the value go up? Because
I was going to say it's worth fighting for. It's worth stealing. So there's sort of there's a truism that people don't fight over things that don't have value. So it's notorious. Got some notoriety.
I legally own this piece of art that was stolen once and recovered. And
it's got a story.
Yeah.
It's got a story. It's got some miles on it. But it doesn't have anything. As long as you're sure it's not a Goldfinch type situation. You have what you have. You have the right thing. Unlike disputes over authenticity, or even making the claim and having an issue can permanently damage the value of an artwork if the dispute is about authenticity. That's a totally different thing. But disputes about ownership, really, as long as you resolve the issue, you're fine.
Okay. Obviously between this and other recent heists, including at the Louvre, it's clear that there are kind of criminals scouting and learning from what has happened, and there might be more of these in the future. I guess two questions. One, what kind of duty of care does the galleries or the foundations kind of owe to the owners of these works of art, and what type of steps do they have to take to ensure their security? And are you seeing kind of a change in security protocols? Are there limitations on what can really be done here? I threw a lot at you.
That's fine. So there's two categories there. One is their own collections and who they're responsible for their own collections. And
that's probably an insurance underwriting thing, right? Where they want to make sure that they're obviously they're taking steps to protect the museum, protect themselves, but also I would imagine the insurance policy has certain requirements for what they have to do.
And then there's your requirements for your contractual, your requirements for art that a museum might be, if it's a museum, your museum might be borrowing from a collector.
Right.
When it comes to artwork that the museum owns and is in their collection, most museums, and the one in Italy was a private museum.
Yeah.
So they may be covered by it's a little different category. It may be covered by their own insurance policy, but most major museums don't have insurance for their collections. They're self-insured. So they're accountable to themselves. They're accountable to their governing boards. They're accountable to public opinion. Right. And at some level, they're accountable to the public charity regulators in the state. But there isn't an immediate. The concern is the loss of the object, not the accountability issue. They're not going to have to explain themselves to a third party again, and that sort of plays into the reporting requirements. If you're more concerned, if you're concerned about recovery, but if you're not concerned about reporting to an insurer, and you want to sort of know what happened before you report out to the public, and there's not really anything to be gained in the short term, you can report internally while you investigate, and deal with the public, and so manage to keep and manage your reputational harm, and at the same time be remedying whatever problems might have occurred.
Right.
If it's password breach, security breach. The situation is different for collectors. With collectors, usually require it if you've lent work to an institution. Usually, they have to tell you immediately. Usually, within 24 hours is like the typical contractual requirement. I would say and for them, usually it's covered. They'll have insurance cover. They'll have their own insurance coverage for things that they're borrowing, and that absolutely requires that the museum adhere to a standard duty of care to treat things like valuable objects in their own, like they would with usual valuable objects in their own collection. And as you saw from the Louvre heist, what we would consider standard of care is I think that a lot of people were sort of amazed when they go to the Louvre, even before the theft, when they go to the Louvre and they see that you're in rooms with open windows with valuable collections. It's sort of a little mind blowing, right? When you go to the Met, there's no open windows, and and if you start to understand, if you start to like look around, you sort of can see the security infrastructure that's there.
Right.
It's pretty amazing, right? The number of guards, you can see the uniform guards. You can sort of look around and sort of start to spot the plainclothes guards and the very and the limited number of pretty secure entry points. Like it's a fortress.
You anticipate kind of a transformation in the security apparatus for these museums in Europe based on recent events, or no?
If they're state run,
Yeah.
and they're in buildings in retrofitting a historic building is,
more expensive than losing a piece of art at once.
and it's a
every-
cultural change too.
Yeah.
But when you talk about collections that are borrowed, they're accountable to the insurer. You have contractual requirements. Many collectors they may require the data room with security. They may require, and it's not just when it's in the room, it's security when artwork is being transported to and from, right? You may want to require that I have an escort, that I have a courier if it's going on a plane, that it's in a transport vehicle with an armed guard, not a standard vehicle. That there be alarms, that there be a security barrier around it, that that has the security barrier with alarms. All these things can be part of your requirements. And also, some borrowers will not be satisfied with the sort of standard is that if something happens with the museum, loss or damage, that you're entitled to the insurance proceeds. That's their sort of standard offer. Many borrowers will insist that the museum also be liable for the amount of the loss, regardless of the whether or when, and the insurer pays.
Right. So no cap on coverage.
It's not just a cap on coverage that the museum's directly. So many people will try to have and we usually recommend trying to have the museum be directly liable for the artwork, and then you may have a decision about whether you want to push for that, depending on what's being asked and your interest in having it exhibited, and the value, and whether it really warrants, in the big picture of your collection, whether you want to go to the Met for that, but you can seek to have it covered by insurance or directly by the borrower.
Yeah. I guess as these thefts occur, if more occur, let us be normal market forces of, investors who are lending out their artwork are going to want more security in place for their, for their.
Right. Right. And I mean, keeping in mind that a couple things. One, you're not in it for the insurance claim because most of this artwork is, it's irreplaceable. It's lost if you have that attachment to the artwork. Your interest is more in ensuring that the artwork is secure, and there's often tremendous value, or not tremendous, but there's value added to a work by having it included in a museum exhibit. And so to many people it's worth the risk, not because you want your artwork to see the light of day.
Yeah.
Because especially if you're a living artist, or you're an heir or an estate, you may feel strongly that you do want the public to be able to have access to this artwork. That's why the whole purpose of this enterprise is to have, it has to have the artwork be seen seen and appreciated as widely as possible. So there's a real benefit to that. But then you try and, it's often a little easier to have agreement on really specific safeguards, right? You tell me how you're going to ship it. Make sure you have approval of the shipping arrangements. You know when it's going to be shipped. You know what the security parameters are in place, and you take a look at it. It's easier to manage specific contractual requirements than to just rely on a duty of care,
Right.
which is a little vague. And then you'll be arguing about it after the fact.
Yeah. Just don't transport in the back of the car.
Or in a container ship or whatever.
I can't imagine being the person at the museum who has to tell the investor that they lost their work of art. I would just send like a quick email like, hey, lost your art. Get back to us if you want to.
Yeah, often you require a phone call.
Yeah, probably a phone call would be good.
And yeah, it's not just lost just for your,
Yeah.
for the sake of this analogy. You're also the guy who has to call them and tell the collector that somebody dropped it.
Yeah.
Or you can't find it.
All uncomfortable phone calls.
Yes.
Well, this is really interesting, and it's actually amazing how once you start to kind of pull the thread a little bit, how much is really there in this type of scenario. If people listening, other attorneys listening, want to find out more about your practice, where should they go? What should they do?
So I'm Judith Wallace. I'm at Carter Ledyard and Milburn, www.clm, Carter, like Christina, Linda, Mary.com.
I'll put it in the show notes as well.
That'd be great. And there's a bio that describes links to a number of the cases that we've talked about today.
That's great. So yeah, if there's you're looking for the person with respect to an art dispute, definitely reach out. And we appreciate your time so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
For more on all things real estate and the law, subscribe to this and our other podcasts. Follow Bergstein, Flynn, Knowlton, and Polino on social media. Subscribe to our newsletter and go to bfklawoffice.com. That's bfklawoffice.com to learn more.